Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I thought it would be nice if I read some chapters from one of my favorite books, the Usborne book of Greek myths, and I hope you will like it. Now let's get started. So we start with the myths. Thousands of years ago, the ancient Greeks told each other stories of gods, monsters, heroes, and heroines. The myths have been passed down to us through the generations, but the tales they tell go back to the very beginning of the time itself. The Birth of the Gods, Chapter 1. At first, according to the ancient Greeks, there were no gods or people, no day or night, no planets or stars. There was just nothingness that stretched on and on forever. Then, out of nowhere, the earth appeared. She was beautiful, with a curved shape and a warm heart. A split second later, the sky came into being. He was everything she was not. While the earth was calm and steady going with hidden depths, the sky was quick and changeable, and couldn't hide anything if he tried. The sky loved the earth so much that he wrapped himself around her and swore they would never be parted. And at first, she felt the same way. The earth's name was Gaia, and the sky was called Uranus. When she first kissed him, he blazed red and gold, making the very first sunset. When Uranus bent his star-crowned head to sleep beside Gaia, he bathed her hills and valleys in silver light. Very soon, they decided to start a family. They were so vast themselves that all of their children turned out to be immense too. First came the Titans, a race of giants and giantesses, so huge that they could pluck trees as if they were daisies, and sit on the mountains as if they were thrones. They were beautiful and strong, and their parents were very proud. Next, Gaia gave birth to 3 Cyclopes, stout, ugly giants who each had just one large and bulging eye. Gaia thought they were perfect, but Uranus wasn't so sure. He remarked flatly, "They are not as good-looking as their brothers and sisters." Their next 3 children were even more monstrous. Each of them had 50 heads and 100 hands. If their mother was any less pleased with them than with her other children, she didn't show it. But their father couldn't bear the sight of them. He exclaimed when he saw them, "They are hideous. Can they live underground? And their ugly Cyclops brothers too? They're spoiling my view." And he pushed them back inside the earth. Gaia was heartbroken and wept rivers of tears at Uranus's cruelty. He was miserable at having upset her. His tears fell as rain and mingled with hers, streaming down hills and pooling in valleys to form great salty seas. But however much he regretted hurting Gaia, Uranus couldn't hide how he felt. "I still love you," he told her, "but I can't love them." Gaia grew more and more resentful. Secretly, she began to plan a way to get rid of Uranus and set her imprisoned children free. One day she said to the Titans, "Your father is old. He is growing weaker by the day. One of you must rule next, and the time has come for you to take control." Despite their great size, the Titans all trembled at the thought of challenging their father. All except one. His name was Cronus. He said, "I'll do it, mother. Just tell me how." She told him, "Climb to the top of the highest mountain, and I'll show you." And Cronus did as she asked. When he reached the top of a mountain, a sickle emerged from the rocks in front of him, its curved blade gleaming in the sun. His mother told him, "This weapon is made from adamant, the hardest part of me. It is the only thing that can possibly harm your father." Cronus picked up the sickle, and his mother called out in a sweet voice, "Uranus, come here, darling." Cronus could almost feel the weight of the sky above him, and he waited. Then a wind blew, the clouds rearranged themselves, and his father appeared. "I'm here, my love," Uranus whispered. Cronus swung the sickle with all his might. The blade flashed as it sliced through the sky. Uranus's gasp of pain rang out across the universe as he was separated forever from the earth. Cronus knew that he had overthrown his father, and he watched triumphantly as Uranus's face began to fade. Uranus said sadly, "It comes to us all. One day you will give way to your own child." "Never," cried Cronus, full of the confidence of youth. He had just set off back down the mountain when Gaia's voice rang out, "Well done. Now he's gone. You can set your brothers free." To his mother's dismay, Cronus shook his head. "They'll only get in the way just now," he said. "Maybe I'll do it later." He asked another Titan, Rhea, to marry him, and they decided to start a family. But despite his confidence, Cronus' father's prediction lingered uncomfortably in his mind. When Rhea gave birth to their first child, he swallowed the baby whole before she even had time to look at it. Rhea just screamed, "What are you doing?" Cronus said, "Calm down, you silly thing. This is the best way to keep children safe. Didn't you know?" Rhea shook her head doubtfully. It sounded like a strange idea, but Cronus seemed so certain, and she didn't know any other Titans who would have children. So she supposed it must be normal. Still, she missed her baby terribly. A while later, she gave birth to their second child. Cronus was about to swallow it when Rhea pleaded, "Couldn't we keep the baby here just for a short time?" Cronus frowned at her. "Don't you want what's best for our family?" he demanded. She nodded sadly and watched him swallow the second baby whole. In the following years, their third, fourth, and fifth children were dealt with in the very same way. When Gaia saw what was happening, she was furious with her son. "Your children aren't safe. They are trapped inside your husband," she told Rhea, "just like my children are trapped inside me." "I knew something wasn't right," Rhea exclaimed. By this time, she was already pregnant with their sixth child. "I'm not letting him swallow this one," she said, wrapping her arms around her belly. When it was time for her to have the baby, she went to a cave in the mountains and gave birth in secret. The baby was a boy. Rhea was delighted with him and named him Zeus. New life was springing up on the earth at this time. When Rhea's baby was born, Gaia sent a team of gentle creatures called nymphs to help look after him. Leaving the baby in their care, Rhea returned to her husband. She handed him a boulder wrapped in blankets. "Here's our sixth child for you to keep safe," she said innocently. And Cronus swallowed the boulder without suspecting a thing. The baby Zeus was so powerful that his cries shook the very mountains. But nymphs standing guard outside the cave caught them in soft clouds so that his father wouldn't hear. Those inside the cave comforted him with songs and fed him on milk and honey. Rhea visited her son whenever she could. She told him all about his grandparents and about what his father had done. Zeus grew up very quickly, and as soon as he was old enough to leave his hiding place, he went to see his father. "Who are you?" Cronus asked the youth, who was glaring at him with a thunderous expression. Without word of an explanation, Zeus punched Cronus hard in the stomach. "Your time's up, father," he said. The giant doubled over, and out of his gaping mouth sprang the boulder he'd swallowed, followed by 5 of his children, now fully grown. Together, Zeus and all his brothers and sisters turned to face their father. They were young, powerful, and very, very angry. Cronus took one look at their faces and knew at once that he was beaten. Cronus was banished from the face of the earth, and the brothers and sisters set about exploring it. As they went, they discovered that they each had their own amazing powers that set them above all other beings. Zeus and his siblings were their first gods. Zeus adored playing with the sky. He loved to shape thunderclouds with his bare hands and send thunderbolts across the sky in dramatic flashes. When his brother Poseidon saw the rolling oceans, he parted their waves with his hands to discover a whole host of startled creatures at the bottom. Their sister, Demeter, found she had green fingers and spent days coaxing flowers into bloom and trees into fruits. The earth herself, their grandmother Gaia, watched peacefully as they tried out their various powers. "Finally, I can go to sleep," she thought, "and trust my family to keep everything safe." But there was one thing she had to take care of first. "Will you at last set my children free?" she asked Zeus, and she told him about the one-eyed Cyclopes and their 100-handed, 50-headed brothers, all imprisoned within her. Zeus agreed. "Of course I will." Gaia opened up a gateway so that he could enter the earth and travel deep underground. So, along with his 2 brothers, Poseidon and Hades, Zeus set off to rescue his monstrous uncles. Deep inside, they discovered a whole different world to the one above. It was lit with an eerie light instead of the sun, and its fields were full of gemstones rather than flowers. "It's wonderful down here," said Hades. "I feel right at home. Let's call it the underworld." Even further down, there was a series of warm, pitch-black caverns. Here they found the 100-handers. Although these monsters were pleased to hear that they were free, they had grown to like living underground, so they decided to stay. In that case, you can be the guardians of this place, suggested Zeus. We'll make it a dungeon for those who have done terrible things in their lifetimes. The 100-handers agreed, and the caverns they guarded came to be known as Tartarus. Next, Zeus and his brothers went to find the Cyclopes. They had made their home in the gleaming seams of metal beneath the mountains, but were terribly squashed and unhappy there. Overjoyed to be set free, they followed the three gods back up to the earth's surface. Once the rescue was complete, Zeus decided the next thing to be done was to divide up his father's kingdom between his brothers and sisters. He took the heavens for himself and asked his most beautiful and loyal sister, Hera, to join him. She became the goddess of marriage and faithfulness. Poseidon was given the oceans to rule, and Hades the underworld. Demeter's role was to tend to all growing things. Their youngest sister, Hestia, didn't want a realm to rule. The Cyclopes were so grateful to the gods that they presented them with gifts. Poseidon received a trident to help him control the oceans. Hades was given a cap that made its wearer invisible, and Zeus received a shining set of thunderbolts. After that, the Cyclopes built a grand palace for the gods. They set it on the clouds above the world's highest mountain, and the gods named it Olympus. Demeter shrouded the top of a mountain in clouds so that only chosen guests could ever catch a glimpse of the great palace of the gods. Meanwhile, down below, ordinary men and women were being born and living their lives like tiny ants beneath the gods' powerful gaze. That is the end of chapter 1. Chapter 2, The Pandora's Box. One morning, Zeus awoke to the delicious smell of freshly baked bread. He had spent all night at a party with the other gods and was feeling rather tired and grumpy. He shouted, "Hestia, bring me some of that bread for my breakfast," somewhat rudely. His sister was the only one of the gods who ever did any baking. Hestia's puzzled face appeared around the door. "I don't know who's making bread, but it's not me," she said. "Who else can it be?" grumbled Zeus, getting out of bed. He followed the smell out of the palace to a gap in the clouds. When he peered down through it, his face darkened with anger. Dotted across the world below, like little red flowers, were hundreds and hundreds of merely burning fires. Zeus roared with rage. "Humans aren't supposed to have fire," he bellowed. "Only we gods have the power to handle it properly." He stormed down to earth immediately and seized the first man he came to by the scruff of the neck. "Who gave you fire?" he demanded. "Prometheus the Titan," the man blurted, turning pale. "That troublemaker," Zeus muttered. "I might have guessed." He dropped the man in a heap on the ground and charged away. Prometheus was at home eating breakfast with Epimetheus, his brother, when Zeus burst through the window. Epimetheus leaped to his feet in alarm, but Prometheus didn't look the slightest bit worried. "Why shouldn't they have fire?" he asked. rolling his eyes. I felt sorry for them, shivering with cold on dark nights, and I could tell they were tired of eating nothing but raw food. Zeus turned purple and looked as though he might explode. "It wasn't yours to give," he roared. "You must have stolen it." "Yes, that was easy enough," Prometheus boasted. "Yesterday, while you gods were at your party, I lit a stalk from the sun and carried it down to earth." He smirked and added, "I taught the humans how to use fire and how to keep it going. You can't take it back now." That was more than Zeus was prepared to stand for. "I'll teach you how it feels to have something stolen," he shouted. He grabbed Prometheus by the arm and began to drag him out of the house. However defiant he was feeling, Prometheus was no match for a god. "Farewell, brother," he called to Epimetheus. "A word of warning. Don't take anything from the gods unless you are prepared to face the consequences." Zeus took Prometheus to a mountain and chained him there. "You can stay here and take your punishment until you're sorry," he said. Every day, a giant eagle sent by Zeus would swoop down on the Titan. Slowly and agonizingly, it would peck out his liver. But although this would have been painful enough to kill anyone else, Prometheus did not die. Every night, his liver grew back, only for the eagle to arrive the next morning and peck it out all over again. Amazingly, Prometheus didn't regret what he had done. "You can torture me until the end of time," he yelled up at the clouds. "I won't ever be sorry." Zeus called all the other gods to a meeting in Olympus and told them what had happened. He was furious with the humans for accepting the gift of fire from Prometheus and had come up with a way to punish them. Working together, the gods sculpted a perfect woman's figure out of clay. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, showered her with beauty. Zeus's daughter, Athena, dressed her in a shimmering gown, and Hermes, Zeus's son, hid a bundle of curiosity in her heart. Then the gods all breathed life into her. The woman's eyes flickered open and she looked around in wonder. She asked, "Who are you?" "We are the gods," Zeus answered. "Your name is Pandora. You are to be the wife of a titan named Epimetheus." He pressed into her hands a large decorated box. "This is the wedding present," he said. "You may keep it in your house, but you must never open it." Pandora asked, "Why not? What's in it?" Hermes told her, ignoring the question and briskly taking her arm. "It's time for you to go now. I'll escort you to your husband's house." When Epimetheus opened the door of his house to find a beautiful woman and a smiling god standing on the doorstep, his brother's warning vanished entirely from his mind. Come in," he said to his guests. He and Pandora got along wonderfully. In fact, they were so in love after an hour of meeting one another that they arranged to get married that very day. When the wedding celebrations were over and the couple went home, Epimetheus noticed the decorated box. "Where did that come from?" he asked his wife. "It's the wedding gift from Zeus," Pandora replied, picking up the box and staring at it wistfully. "He gave it to me before I'd even met you, and said we must never open it." Epimetheus said firmly, "Then we should do as he says." He took the box from her and placed it on a shelf. Pandora nodded, but she couldn't help wondering what was inside it. The next time she was alone in the house, she picked it up again and held it in her lap, tracing the decorations on the lid with her fingers. What use is a box we can't open? She asked herself. When her husband came home, she put it back hurriedly and said nothing. One morning, a few days later, she was waving goodbye to him through the window when the box caught her eye again. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at it for a while. Her curiosity burned inside her. Perhaps Zeus meant I shouldn't open it before I was married, she said to herself, and she took the box down from the shelf. What harm can it possibly do if I just have a little look? She took a deep breath and opened the lid a tiny crack. A terrible screeching filled the air, and the contents of the box burst out, flinging the lid from her hands. Pandora watched helplessly as hundreds of writhing, horrible things billowed into the air. They were things that people had never experienced before: war and disease, hatred, malice, and jealousy. They whirled around, filling the room, and then seeped out of the open window and spread into the rest of the world. For a few moments, Pandora was unable to move. She sat staring at the box, numb with despair at what she has done. Then, as she watched, one last little thing fluttered out. It was pretty and delicate, and not at all like the other things. It flew up out of the window and into the sky, leaving a trail of light behind it. Pandora watched it fly away, and despite herself, she felt her heart lift. The very last thing that had come out of the box was hope. So from that moment, although life on Earth would never be easy again, no matter what terrible hardships they had to endure, people never gave up hope. Chapter 3. The Chariot of the Sun. The queen looked down at her son's troubled face and sighed. She knew all too well what he was about to ask her. "I've been thinking," Phaithon said. "You and I are so alike. You're obviously my mother, but I'm not in the least like the king, who is my real father." His mother could hide the truth from him no longer. "You are right," she said, stroking her son's coppery hair. "You aren't the king's son by birth, although he loves you dearly. Now you are ready to know the truth. I'll tell you. Your real father is Helios, the sun god." Phaithon glanced at the horizon where the sun was beginning to set, casting a fiery orange glow into the sky. "Really?" he whispered. "Really," the queen replied. She gestured to his golden-haired sisters playing on the lawn. "He is your sister's father too." Phaithon turned to her with determination in his eyes. "I need to meet my real father," he said. "Will you tell me how to find him?" His mother explained how to reach the sun god's palace and saddled him a trusty horse to ride. "Come back safely," she called as he set off into the evening, and his sisters all stood in a row and waved goodbye. Phaithon headed east. He rode all night until at last, just before morning, he reached the rosy gates of dawn. His father's golden palace rose up majestically behind them. It gleamed so brightly he had to shade his eyes. Leaving his horse at the gates, Phaithon went inside. He climbed the glittering steps of the palace with his heart in his mouth and knocked at the vast gold door. When a servant opened it, he said, as boldly as he was able, "Please tell Helios that his son has come to see him." The servant nodded and disappeared for a few moments. Then he returned and showed Phaithon through a grand hall, studded with pearls and precious jewels, into another room where a man was sitting on a golden throne. The man was handsome and noble-looking, with bright golden hair and a golden beard. He smiled warmly at the nervous boy and said, "Phaithon, my son, welcome. You know my name?" Phaithon said in surprise, "I know everything about you," Helios replied. "I have watched you every day since you were born." Phaithon frowned. "Then why have I never met you?" he asked. "Come and sit down," Helios said, "and I'll explain. My job as a sun god is to drive a chariot carrying the sun across the sky. Early every morning, I have to harness up my 4 horses and set off. I carry the sun up and up to the highest point, and then down the other side of the sky to the west. After sunset, I sail back home on the river of oceans that surround the earth. Then, at dawn, I have to start over again. If I came to see you, then the sun wouldn't appear in the sky. The whole world would be dark and cold." "I see," said Phaithon, but his eyes were full of disappointment. Helios felt a pang of guilt. "Let me make it up to you somehow," he said impulsively. "Name any one thing that would make you feel better, and it's yours." He smiled as the boy's eyes lit up, but then Phaithon said, "I'd like to take your place for a day. I want to drive your chariot across the sky." Helios' smile faded. "The horses are fiery-natured and very difficult to control," he said. "Suppose I take you in the chariot with me for the day instead?" Phaithon shook his head. "I want to do it by myself," he said. Helios looked at his son in silence for a moment, but he didn't have the heart to turn him down. "Very well," he said at last, "but you must listen very carefully to my instructions. Have you ever driven a chariot before?" "Hundreds of times," Phaithon lied. "Good. Well, that's a start," said his father, and he led him outside to where a team of stable hands was harnessing 4 lively horses to a golden chariot. Phaithon could barely look at the chariot, for in the back of it sat the enormous, blindingly bright sun. They walked to the front, and Phaithon beamed at his father, dazzled by the glory of his task. "Don't steer the chariot too high, or you will scorch the heavens," Helios instructed him. "And don't go too low, or you'll burn the earth to a crisp." "Phaithon, are you listening to me?" Yes, Phaithon said impatiently. The horses were harnessed, but they reared and snorted wildly. Their manes flickered like flames, and fire burned in their eyes. "These horses need a firm hand at all times," Helios said. "If you let them have their heads, even for a moment, all will be lost." The boy climbed into the chariot and took hold of the reins. "You must be careful, Phaithon," Helios told him anxiously. Phaithon nodded, barely listening in his excitement. The rosy gates of dawn swung open, and the horses leaped into action. He let out a yell of exhilaration as the chariot lurched into the open sky. Driving his father's chariot was better than any dream. As he soared, the sky turned from black to warm blue, and the land below was flooded with the sun's golden light. Higher and higher, the chariot climbed, and Phaithon felt the power of the horses through the reins. as though their strength was his own. Faster, faster, he urged them, as they climbed so high that he could almost touch the stars. He flung his head back, thrilled, and gazed at the twinkling constellations, the great lumbering bear, and the bull with his mighty horns. Phaithon was so busy gazing at the stars that he didn't notice that the horses were climbing far too high. Behind him, the sun was blazing a white-hot trail across the sky. Only when the stars were so close that the bull threatened to gore him with his twinkling horns did Phaithon look down and gasp. The earth was suddenly frighteningly far away. Terrified, the boy grappled with the reins, but the strength of the horses was too much for him. They lurched from side to side and then plunged down, heading straight for the earth. It was all Phaithon could do to hold on. Down below, people all over the world were watching the sky in horror at the strange and worrying sight of the sun veering from its usual path. Chariots sped down and down toward the ground. The horses were completely out of control. Phaithon tugged desperately on the reins, but it may as well have been an end for all the effect he had. Just as he thought, the chariot was about to crash into the ground. The horses changed direction of their own accord and galloped away wildly, hurtling perilously low over the land. Rivers began to boil, streams evaporated in puffs of steam, and seas shrank from their shores in the heat. None of this had escaped the notice of the gods. At that very moment, Helios was in Olympus, above the clouds, having been summoned there by Zeus. "What is that boy doing in your chariot?" he demanded, glaring sternly at the lesser god. "He's my son," Helios began weakly. "Oh, never mind the explanation," Zeus interrupted. "The important thing is, how are we going to stop the damage he's doing?" Helios stared miserably down at the chariot, which was lurching over the mountains, smelting deep icy glaciers and causing floods in the valleys beneath them. "It will stop at the end of the day," he said haltingly. "It's barely middle day now," Zeus snapped. "He could have destroyed the entire planet by this evening." "I'm sorry, Helios, but there's nothing else to do." He pulled out a thunderbolt, took aim, and threw it at the chariot. Poor Phaithon never knew what hit him. The thunderbolt blasted him from the chariot of the sun. His lifeless body plunged through the sky like a falling star, eventually landing in a wide, winding river. Without the panic-stricken boy tugging on the reins, the horses gradually calmed down. They crossed the sky much more quickly than usual, resulting in an unusually short day. Helios waited in the west for the empty chariot, tears spilling from his eyes. His horses thundered in, their mouths foaming and their eyes still wide and wild. Through his tears, Helios murmured soothingly until they came to a shuddering halt in front of him and lowered their tired heads to nuzzle his outstretched fingers. Phaithon's poor mother and sisters hurried to the river where he had fallen. Phaithon's mother had realized what must be happening as soon as the sun had started hurtling off course. She had seen the thunderbolt and watched with a sinking heart as a tiny black speck fell from the sky. When they reached the river, however, Phaithon's body was long gone. They sank to their knees and wept. His sisters couldn't bring themselves to leave the banks of the river. In fact, they stayed there so long, they gradually turned into poplar trees, which continued to weep, and their tears fell as golden amber. Phaithon's mother returned home alone that night to find Helios waiting on the steps of her palace. She looked at him with empty eyes. "I can't do anything to bring him back," the sun god said sadly. and I can't tell you how sorry I am, but I wanted you to know that our son will be remembered. Zeus had placed him among the stars. He pointed up to the night sky, where a new twinkling constellation of stars had appeared. Ever since then, Phaithon can be seen at night, high in the sky, where he had felt so elated. The constellation came to be known as Auriga, which means the charioteer. How the seasons came to be. Long ago, when the world was young, there were no such things as seasons. The sun shone and the rain fell in equal measures all year round. And a goddess named Demeter took care of everything that grew. It was she who drew new shoots from the soil and made the flowers bloom, who added the blush to ripe apples and turned the corn golden in the fields. Her mother loved her so dearly, she barely ever let her out of sight. But one day, something happened that would change that forever. Persephone was picking violets in the meadow with her friends when the ground beneath them started to shake. Then, with a deafening roar, the earth split wide open and a chariot pulled by 4 jet black horses. As it thundered past them, a clothed figure leaned out and swept Persephone off her feet. Persephone's friends could do nothing but watch in horror as the chariot swung around and plunged back into the chasm, taking poor Persephone with it. Then, as suddenly as the opening had appeared, the ground closed up again. When the girls told Demeter, she rushed into the meadow. The grass was unruffled, betraying no sign that anything had happened. She demanded, pounding the ground in frustration, "Tell me who took my daughter." The meadow remained silent. Demeter was inconsolable. For the next year, she searched the world for signs of her daughter, but all in vain. Meanwhile, everything she had tended so lovingly was neglected. The sun shone too harshly, and the rain forgot to fall. Fruit withered, crops failed, and entire forests simply lay down and died. Months passed, and animals and people began to die of starvation, but Demeter didn't ever seem to notice. Eventually, the king of the gods, Zeus, summoned her to his palace in the clouds above Mount Olympus. Demeter hurried there, with hope rising in her heart. "Have you found out who took my daughter?" she asked as soon as she arrived. "I've known all along who it was," Zeus answered. "What?" gasped Demeter. "Why didn't you tell me?" Zeus fixed the goddess with a piercing gaze. "Be honest. You wouldn't give up your daughter for anyone, would you? No matter how suitable a match?" "No man is good enough for her," replied Demeter. "It's not a man I'm talking about," Zeus said. "It's Hades, god of the underworld, who took Persephone." Demeter turned white. "She's in the land of the dead?" she whispered. "It's even worse than I feared." "How do you know she isn't happy there?" asked Zeus. "Hades is clearly in love with her, although I admit this courtship may have been a little unusual." "Unusual?" cried Demeter. "It's unforgivable." Zeus sighed. "Then it seems I have little alternative," he muttered. He called to Hermes, the messenger god. "Go down into the underworld," he told him. Deep in the underworld, Hermes found Persephone and Hades sitting in a dark underground garden. Instead of flowers and shrubs, the garden was full of crystals. and sparkling gemstones. In fact, there was nothing you'd find in a normal garden, except for one small twisted fruit tree. Hades frowned when he saw Hermes. "What brings you here?" he asked. "Zeus sent me," Hermes answered, sitting down beside Persephone. "How are you?" he asked her gently. "Hades treats me very well," Persephone replied, glancing at the pale, handsome god at her side. "But living down here in the dark all the time is..." Her voice trailed away as she saw Hades' mournful expression. She looked down at her hands. "I'm terribly homesick. I miss the sunshine in the sky, and I miss my mother most of all." Hermes turned to Hades. "You must let her return," he told him. "That's impossible," Hades said stubbornly. "I love her. I can't live without her." "Nor can anyone else," said Hermes sharply. "The earth is falling to wrack and ruin because of her mother's grief. It is Zeus's will that Persephone be returned." Hades sighed. If it came down to Zeus's will against his own, there was no doubt who would win. Then something occurred to him. "Just a minute," he said. "It's only possible to leave the underground if nothing passes your lips while you are here," he said. "The fates made that rule a long time ago, and it cannot be altered." "True," Hermes agreed. "Even Zeus would not deny the age-old law." "Persephone, have you eaten anything since you've been here?" she asked. Persephone bit her lip and didn't answer, but her glance strayed to the little fruit tree. "You shared a pomegranate with me," prompted Hades. "Don't you remember?" "I only ate 6 seeds." Persephone protested. "Is that enough to mean I can never go home?" "But why do you want to leave?" Hades asked. "I've made you my queen. I love you more than anything." "If you love me so much," Persephone retorted, "you let me go home and see my mother." Hades looks desperately sad. "If I let you go, your mother would never allow you to return," he said quietly. "We'd never ever see one another again." Instead of looking glad, as Hermes expected, Persephone suddenly looked very forlorn at the idea. When the couple turned to him for an answer, he said, "The only possible solution is this. For 6 months of the year, one for every seed she has eaten, Persephone must stay here with you, Hades. For the other 6 months, she must go home to her mother." Hades pressed Persephone's hand to his lips with a cry of joy, and she couldn't help but smile. That year, when Persephone arrived home, the earth blossomed with Demeter's joy. Thousands of green shoots burst through the soil, new leaves unfurled in the trees, and flowers sprang into bloom everywhere. All summer long, everything thrived. But as the time of Persephone's departure drew near, the grass turned brown, flowers faded, and trees shed their leaves like tears. For the 6 months that Persephone lived in the underworld, all of nature mourned with Demeter. Since then, every year has gone through the same cycle. When summer approaches, the earth sings with life. When winter comes, it falls silent again, sorrowfully awaiting the return of spring. Perseus and the snake hair monster. "I have decided to ask Princess Hippodameia to marry me," King Polydectes announced to his court. completely out of the blue. One of his younger subjects, Perseus, smiled with relief. For months, the king had been pestering his mother to marry him, but she wasn't the least bit interested. Now he was 18, Perseus felt it was his job to protect his mother from unwelcome suitors, even if her admirer was the king himself. Luckily, it seemed the king had turned his attention elsewhere. Of course, I'll need to take gifts when I ask for her hand, Polydectes continued. I wouldn't want her to refuse me. His courtiers laughed politely and immediately began to offer white horses and fine jewels from their coffers for the king to give his bride to be. Perseus was so busy basking in relief that the king's voice nearly made him jump out of his skin. And what will you give me, young Perseus? In his eagerness for the king's proposal to be accepted, Perseus got rather carried away. How about a rare orchid from Mount Olympus? He suggested extravagantly. Or golden apples from Hera's magic tree. Or I could even bring you the head of Medusa. It's a peculiar engagement gift, but yes, I accept, said the king, cutting him short. Perseus looked at him questioningly. Medusa's head will do nicely, the king said. Perseus nodded. Turning very slightly pale, Medusa was a gorgon, a monstrous creature with a woman's face and hundreds of snakes for hair. Not only that, anyone who met her gaze was instantly turned to stone. Perseus left the palace feeling as if he had bitten off rather more than he could chew. A sour smile crept over the king's lips as he watched him go. Now he's out of the way, he muttered darkly. Perhaps his mother will have more time for me. Perseus was too busy thinking about the task ahead to suspect the king's true intentions. May the gods help me, he murmured to himself as he walked along. I haven't the faintest idea where to begin. I don't even know where Medusa lives. Only her three sisters can tell you that, said a strange voice above him. Perseus looked up to find a bright-skinned young man hovering in the air. He was wearing sandals with fluttering gold wings which kept him aloft. Perseus stared, open-mouthed. It was Hermes, the messenger god. Hermes smiled. These will take you to the Gorgon sisters, he said, and handed Perseus a pair of winged sandals just like his own. Then he gave Perseus a bag and a soft brown cap. Wearing this cap will make you invisible, so it'll be easier to get close to Medusa, he explained. It belongs to Hades, so do look after it, won't you? The bag is to carry the head in, should you succeed. Thank you, stammered Perseus. You'll need these as well, came another voice, as Athena, the mighty goddess of war, appeared out of thin air. She handed him a sword and a bronze shield so highly polished that he could see his own astonished face in it. Good luck, she added. And with that, the god and the goddess vanished. Perseus eagerly strapped on his new sandals. At once, the tiny wings began to flutter, lifting him off the ground. The next thing he knew, he was soaring high in the sky, far beyond the only kingdom he'd ever known. He flew for miles across the sea and eventually came within sight of land. The sandals took him down and down until he landed gently on the pebbled shore at the mouth of a cave. Perseus heard muffled voices, so he poked his head into the cave and called, Is anybody home? A hoarse voice cried, A visitor, a visitor. Come in, croaked another. Hurry up, let's see you, said a third. Inside the cave, Perseus came across the strangest sight he had ever seen. 3 wrinkled old crones were huddled around a fire. They barely had any teeth, and they only had a single eye between them all. As they spoke, they passed it around, each one taking a turn to look at their visitor. Why have you come? Asked the one holding the eye. Hermes said, You could tell me where Medusa lives, replied Perseus. Why should we? Demanded another sister, grabbing the eye and thrusting it into Perseus' face to examine him. So can pay my respects, answered Perseus uncomfortably. He's lying, shrieked the crone. The third snatched the eye and held it up. You are right, she agreed. We shouldn't tell him a thing. Let me look, said the first crone. But as her sister passed the eye to her, Perseus started forward and slipped his hand beneath it. The eyeball dropped into his palm. Where is it? Demanded the first crone, grasping around in the air. I just handed it to you, silly, retorted her sister. You must have dropped it, wailed the first. Not again, groaned the other sister. It was weeks before we found it last time. All 3 of them began to grope around on the floor for the missing eyeball. Said Perseus, It's no use looking down there. He's stolen it, screeching one of the crones, and she lunged at him blindly. Perseus hoped easily out of the way. Tell me where Medusa lives, and I'll give it back. No, howled all 3 sisters. Tell me now, Perseus insisted, or I'll throw this eyeball into the sea and you'll never find it. She is in the forest, on the other side of the mountains, blurted one of the sisters holding out her hand. Perseus placed the eyeball in her palm. Thank you, he said, and walked out of the cave, leaving the sisters squabbling over their precious eye. Filled with confidence after his first success, Perseus leaped into the air. His winged sandals took flight, and he soared over the mountains to Medusa's lair. He reached the forest by sunset. The sun had dyed the sky blood red, and birds were singing farewell to the day. Perseus skimmed low over the treetops, looking for signs of Medusa's cave. He passed over the part of the forest that was strangely clothed in silence. No birds sang, no leaves rustled with life. Cautiously, he descended through the trees. He landed on the forest floor and noticed a songbird sitting motionless on a low branch. It had been turned to stone mid-song. Its beak was open, and he could see every tiny feather on its lifeless breast. Perseus began to make his way slowly through the trees. Then something stopped him in his tracks. An armed warrior stood in his way, a stone statue with unseeing stone eyes and an expression of terror on his face. Further along the path was another statue, and then another. Perseus followed the trail of Medusa's victims until he came to her cave. Quietly, he pulled the cap of invisibility onto his head. Then he drew his sword and stepped into the gloom. A strange, low, hissing noise seeped from the depths of the cave. That must be her, Perseus thought. I have to make sure I don't come face to face with her, or I'll meet the same end as the others before me. He held up the polished shield Athena had given him and looked into it. The cave was reflected perfectly as in a mirror, looking only at the reflection to guide his way. He headed cautiously in the direction of the noise. Perseus followed the hissing deeper and deeper into the cave until finally he saw the Gorgon herself reflected in the shield. She was lying at the far end of the chamber, fast asleep, all the snakes on her head breathing softly. She was so monstrous that even the sight of her reflection made Perseus' blood run cold. Sword at the ready, Perseus crept closer and closer. However, just as he drew within striking distance, he stumbled on a rock. It skittered across the floor and hit the wall with an echoing crash. Medusa awoke with a jump. "Who goes there?" she shrieked. She leaped into the feed, and the snakes of her head started writhing around. Hissing furiously, Perseus stood still and held his breath. Medusa glared around the cave, but as Perseus was invisible, she saw nothing. She took a couple of steps toward, and Perseus seized his chance. He swung his sword as hard as he could at her neck, but it was difficult to judge the distance. Looking only at the reflection, his sword lopped off several snakes, but it missed her neck by a good few inches. Medusa glared wildly in Perseus' direction, and he felt the stony power of her gaze boring through him. "I know you're there. Reveal yourself, coward," she taunted. "Are you too afraid to look me in the eyes?" Perseus kept his eyes firmly on his shield. Quietly, he picked up a rock and tossed it across the cave. It landed with a crash, and Medusa spun around towards the sound and pounced. Perseus sprang at her and, as quick as a flash, sliced through her neck. Her head rolled onto the floor, eyes wide open, and the snakes fell limp and silent. Careful not to meet Medusa's gaze, even in death, Perseus picked up the head by its snake hair and put it carefully into the bag. He was about to set off when he heard a noise outside the cave. He froze as two other Gorgons came inside. "Medusa," one of them called, "are you awake?" Perseus, still invisible, pressed himself against the wall of the cave as they passed. "Who did this?" screamed one, as she saw Medusa's headless body sprawled on the floor. The other let out such a piercing moan that rocks began to crack and crumple from the roof of the cave. Perseus edged out of the cave unseen and took flight. As he rose high into the sky, the realization of his success filled him with dizzying delight. He swept over the forest, soared over the tops of the mountains, collided over the sea, crossed the flame-hot desert, and skimmed low over the coast beyond, cooling his face in the sea breeze. When he reached Greece, he went straight to his mother. "I'm so glad you're safe," she said, hugging him tightly. But then she said, "I have bad news though. I'm afraid I have to marry the king today. I can refuse only on pain of death." "But he's supposed to be marrying Princess," Perseus began, and then he realized his mistake. "I'll see about that," he said, and marched off to the palace right away with the bag containing Medusa's head still slung over his shoulder. When he presented himself before the king, a murmur of surprise rippled around the assembled crowd. King Polydectes eyed him coldly. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "I've brought you Medusa's head," Perseus replied, "as I said I would." "Nonsense," the king snorted. "You could never kill Medusa. Do you even know how many real men have tried and failed? I have the head right here if you'd like to see it," said Perseus, his voice simmering with anger. Show me, ordered the king. Everyone who believes me, warned Perseus, looked away now. And he held up Medusa's head. Many people averted their eyes, but the king and all his courtiers were turned to stone where they sat, with ugly expressions of horror and disbelief fixed on their faces forever.